Karey, welcome to View from the Owner Room. We're so glad to have you with us today.
Thanks, Karen. Glad to be here.
I wanted to ask you how you got into advising families and family businesses on philanthropy. What is your background that puts you in the place of being an expert on this?
So it wasn't intentional. I was a practicing lawyer before I came to Goldman Sachs, and my area of practice was tax-exempt law and private clients. And my private clients happened to be, fortunately, very philanthropic. And so when I came to Goldman Sachs about 20 years ago, I was given the opportunity to focus on philanthropy, including running our donor advised funds that we have here.
Now, I'm going to guess that's both really interesting and sometimes complicated work, because I'm guessing every family is different. But tell me, what is it like to be working in this field?
It's probably the best job anyone could ever want to have. Families, we're fortunate to have families across the US and actually throughout the world who are dedicating a substantial amount of resources to philanthropy. The impulse to give is the commonality, but the values to be expressed and the way of going about making the world a better place is where the diversion becomes very wide. But it's really wonderful working with people on something that is fulfilling to them personally, but also impactful in our society.
I can imagine, because it is work you literally can point to the good that is done as a result of that work. I think that's pretty rare.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I don't have to find meaning in my job. So exactly.
I think that sounds awesome. Well, I'm curious if you find that families are often at a similar stage in their family business, their family wealth, what generation they're in when they decide that this is something that they want to do as a family, develop some kind of philanthropic approach or strategy.
So I would say the commonality is I would label it transitions. So pretty much every discussion that I have with families and why they're driven to come talk to me is they're going through some sort of transition. Either their business has gotten a lot more successful, so they have a lot of financial assets that they're looking to do more with in terms of the community. They might be more often selling their business or a portion of their business and want to dedicate some component of that to philanthropy. Or they're inheriting. The senior generation has died and allocated a portion of the family wealth either to a family foundation or a donor advised fund, or they're transitioning, I guess, at the end, that family foundation.
Do you find that families have often somehow prepared themselves for this moment, or are they more often than not sort of overwhelmed or surprised by the complexity of getting on the same page, making the specific decisions? How hard a transition moment is this for families? It feels like it should be filled with happiness and joy because it's such a great thing, but I'm guessing it's not always quite so simple.
Yes, transition implies change, which at the end of the day leads to stress. So I guess I would say that unfortunately it's a smaller number of folks than we would like to see prepare the next generation or successors to take on the mantle. And there are such differences generationally between approaches. So a common approach, I would say, that we're seeing quite a bit of now is, the greatest generation is moving on. And often they were very genteel in their approach to philanthropy. So whoever asked them for money, they gave them. They gave that money too. And oftentimes there was the call it patriarch and maybe one longtime family employee who sort of just cut checks. And then boom, the patriarch dies and the next generation is sort of left with a significant amount of assets to really rethink about how to deploy that into society. Sometimes but not always. There's some direction, but there's a lot of questions around, what did our family want? How are we going to work together as siblings? And typically by this time there's grandchildren or spouses in the mix. So sort of rethinking how the family should redefine the classic structure can be fairly stressful.
So I generalize with you a little bit. I know every family is probably different, but what advice would you give to a family that comes to you in this moment of transition where they are finding it stressful? Is there one or two or three things that they should think about in the beginning to begin to get on the same page, or ways that they should delegate or appoint certain people to take the lead? What's a good way? I'm in a family and I'm overwhelmed. We want to do this. We can't agree on anything. Grandpa used to give ridiculous sums to a charity I don't believe in, and I'm really interested in these, and my brother believes in something else. How would you guide us to start having the right conversations or making the right decisions so that we can move forward with what is a common goal, which is to do something really important philanthropically?
So usually we start by trying to take the stress out of the situation. There's time to and really encourage reflection on what the family wants to accomplish. To be honest, we suggest that advisors be called in. We educate people that there actually are people who can help through these different pain points that they might be experiencing, to really try to either gel in terms of a cohesive approach, or sometimes a singular approach isn't even necessary. You could have a strategic plan for your foundation, but then sort of leave room for some individuation, if you will, on the parts of the different family members. But think about that. Call in experts, folks like Banyan, who specialize in communication, transitions, structure, things like that, to help them be successful.
Do you think that it is possible for families to have one goal, share it all, and agree that all the money, all the philanthropic effort goes into one foundation, one purpose? Or do you think most families need to have some room for that individuation as you described it?
I would say the latter, because families today, it's rare that I ever see families anymore where everybody is concentrated in one geographic area, that they're all focused on benefiting, because people have moved to many different areas of the country, if not the world. Interests are different, and it is possible to have a common goal, but for sure it works better when people have some wiggle room, if you will, for their individual passions.
One thing I know we've seen in our work is often that the younger generations, because their family name is so famous, or it's known that their family does have money, etc., the younger people don't have control over that so much, but people expect them to be giving to all the charities and buying a table at their pet events. What advice do you give for both generations, I guess, in helping the younger generation find their proper place, both in their growth within the family and their growth in the philanthropic world, so that they don't feel embarrassed or hamstrung to what they can and can't do with the public perception that they have money and they should be giving?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because when we start talking to people, nobody wants there to be too many rules in the family. But actually what we encourage people to do is to put a lot of structure around, the rules, so that people sort of understand and know, what's expected of them, and what they can be guaranteed of, if you will. So many families will, and this is a hard topic, it's always communication. It's hard to say, I individually don't really have the wherewithal to make the commitments I'm expected of on these boards that I serve on, but everybody in the family agrees that community service is a desirable outcome for us. So often the family will agree that if you serve on a board, no questions asked, this amount of money as a family value for connectivity with the community is going to be allocated to you to use in your discretion in that role. So it's a great question. It comes up quite a bit.
So if I wanted to serve on a board in the scenario you just described, is it also a good practice to have some kind of a vetting or approval process if I'm a younger person? Or should families say, if it's important to you, you believe it's community service, we will support you with whatever this amount of money? I'm just curious, how much individual expression do I get to have?
It's a great question. And of course, I always sort of, the way I say it to people is, are you trying to do family with a bold philanthropy or family philanthropy? And what I mean by that is if your family goal is to encourage active engagement in the community, to allow for people to express that in a way that is meaningful to them, is probably the route to success. Now, I speak with many founders who say, this is the path. These are the types of organizations that are acceptable to our family, and it's their choice, right? That's part of the choosing in terms of what you want to really accomplish at the end of the day. And if it is supporting certain aspects of charity, you might be better off involving, turning into more of a quote unquote professionalized foundation where you bring in independent board members and, really run it that way.
So that's a good question. Define what that means. What is a professionalized foundation? What's the difference between that and one that the family is largely controlling or running?
So I would think that people would define that as a foundation that is not controlled by, at the end of the day, the family members. So it has a majority independent board, and it has a professional staff that adhere to a particular agreed upon mission statement. And really, so the family might participate, but they're just a voice in a larger group of folks who are making the decisions.
And the alternative, if the family wants to really run it themselves, what's the benefit of doing that?
So I think the benefit of doing that, although the first thing that I always talk with people about these days after many years of observing this is, I think the benefit is, and particularly you see this when you get down to the grandchildren level, is there's a desire at that level to have something in common with their cousins. Because as the family gets more extended, obviously the wealth creators know each other, the siblings who grow up in the same household know each other, but often the grandchildren don't. And so having them have that legacy in their family and the family story is very important as the generations go on. But I will say that figuring out how you're going to operate that. So many times families say, okay, you, Susie, but you, Karen, you're in charge this year. You're in charge of this year, Karen. And Karen suddenly looks up and she's like, wait a minute, this isn't fun. I'm doing all these administrative things that I'm not really, certain of how to do. And that's not the fun part. And so really searching out operational support so that you can do the harder and at the end more rewarding part, which is the grant making, is part of the recipe for success.
So what I think I'm hearing you say is that the expression of a family value through philanthropy comes after figuring out what the family does value, what the family values are. And so that has to be articulated, thought about, and that should inform the role for the younger generation, how much the family needs to control or wants to control it versus a professionalized thing. That philanthropy should be after hard and continuing dynamic work on family values have been done. Do I hear you correctly with that?
Exactly. Agreed.
Okay. So I'm curious if you've seen people make mistakes, people that a common thread of 3 things people do that shouldn't do, or the things that you wish people would not assume. I'm just curious what advice you would give to people that others have learned the hard way.
So there's a few things. The first, as I mentioned, is this failure to get sort of operational support. It sounds easy, but honestly, for some reason, this notion of volunteerism on the part of the family and taking that on to do those tasks, hold meetings, send emails to all the constituents. That's something that people often overlook. I guess another mistake that people make is assuming that something really does have to continue to be a family activity. Many times, there will be an inherited foundation. It's been inherited for a long time, and really the family members don't any longer have common values. It's not that they dislike each other, but they're really working in their own ways. And so keeping something like that together is probably not efficient or enjoyable. And so sort of throwing in the towel and saying, maybe we just divide this out, maybe a better answer. And then that last point of failure to put enough structure around the entities so that there is clear guidance on what is expected, what we're doing, all of those things is another common mistake.
Can philanthropy keep a family close, or do people expect too much of that? If there is a foundation or a desire to support certain activities, is that enough for a family to stay close across generations, or is that just a piece of the puzzle because it's not a panacea for all?
I would just say it's just a part of the puzzle. I mean, if I knew the answer to the question of how do you keep families close, it is a part of the puzzle, but I think the thing that people don't really recognize is how hard you have to work, to really keep a multi-generation family connected and, sort of happy and maintaining wealth, right? Maintaining the personal wealth, the philanthropic wealth, and their health and well-being.
So let's I guess end on a positive note of thinking about, so what things should families do to try to make sure that the next generations are connected to and inspired by the philanthropic values or the desire to give back to the world? How do you in some ways inculcate that so that's part of their culture as well?
So I would say there's a couple of different approaches that are successful. One is, if you do have a family philanthropic entity, is to think about, how you're going to involve that next or third generation, and to, do things that you otherwise wouldn't naturally do. It's not natural for families necessarily to have meetings. It's not natural for families to have business-like topics and agendas in those meetings, but when you do it, and have a setting where that can happen, that's where the values get translated. I think one of the earliest lessons I ever learned, Karen, back to my law days when I was 25 and started practicing law, is people would have their kids who are 18, not much younger than me, come in and talk to me about their inheritance and how to think about this. And I would almost just naturally interview the parent and say, what is this money for? Why did you set aside this money? What are your hopes for this money to do for this family member? And sure enough, if not 5 years later, I heard those values that came from the parent coming out of the mouth of that child. And so that's one way to sort of set up for success, is to be intentional about it.
And I guess have conversations about why we value this as a family. We do this because we care about this, or grandpa's legacy meant he needed to be able to provide for other immigrants or whatever. I assume that articulating and never assuming everyone understands why you're choosing what you choose to do is a healthy way for that to come out of their mouths over time as well.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your guidance and enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for having me, Karen.